I feel that this award was not made to me as a man, but to my work, a life's work in the agony and sweat of the human spirit, not for glory and least of all for profit, but to create out of the materials of the human spirit something which did not exist before. So this award is only mine in trust. It will not be difficult to find a dedication for the money part of it commensurate with the purpose and significance of its origin. But I would like to do the same with the acclaim too, by using this moment as a pinnacle from which I might be listened to by the young men and women already dedicated to the same anguish and travail, among whom is already that one who will someday stand here where I am standing. Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. He must learn them again. He must teach himself that the basis of all things is to be afraid, and teaching himself that, forget it forever, leaving no room in his workshop for anything but the old verities and truths of the heart, the old universal truths lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Until he does so, he labors under a curse. He writes not of love but of lust, of defeats in which nobody loses anything of value, of victories without hope, and most of all without pity or compassion. His griefs grieve on no universal bones, leaving no scars. He writes not of the heart but of the glands. Until he relearns these things, he will write as though he stood among and watched the end of man. I decline to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice still talking. I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet's, the writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars to help him endure and prevail. Anse keeps on rubbing his knees. His overalls are faded. On one knee a serge patch cut out of a pair of Sunday pants wore iron slick. No man mislikes it more than me, he says. A fellow's got to guess ahead now and then, I say, but come long and short, it won't be no harm done neither way. She'll want to get started right off, he says. It's far enough to Jefferson at best, but the roads is good now, I say. It's fixing to rain tonight, too. His folks buries at New Hope, too, not 3 miles away. But it's just like him to marry a woman born a day's hard ride away and have her die on him. He looks out over the land, rubbing his knees. No man so mislikes it, he says. They'll get back in plenty of time, I say. I wouldn't worry none. It means $3, he says. Might be it won't be no need for them to rush back no way, I says. I hope it. She's a-going, he says. Her mind is set on it. It's a hard life on women for a fact. Some women. I mind my mammy lived to be 70 and more. Worked every day, rain or shine. Never a sick day since her last chap was born, until one day she kind of looked around her, and then she went and taken that lace-trimmed nightgown she had had for 45 years and never wore out of the chest, and put it on and lay down on the bed and pulled the covers up and shut her eyes. You all will have to look out for Pa the best you can, she said. I'm tired. Anse rubbed his hand on his knees. The Lord giveth, he says. We can hear Cash a-hammering and a-sawing beyond the corner. It's true. Never a truer breath was ever breathed. The Lord giveth, I say. That boy comes up the hill. He is carrying a fish nigh as long as he is. He slings it to the ground and grunts ha and spits over his shoulder just like a man, done nigh as long as he is. What's that, I say, a hog? Where did you get it? Down to the bridge, he says. He turns it over, the underside caked over with dust where it's wet, the eye coated over, humped under the dirt. Are you aiming to leave it laying there? Anse says. I aim to show it tomorrow, Vardaman says. He looks toward the door. We can hear the talking coming on the draft. Cash, too, knocking and hammering at the boards. There's company in there, he says. Just my folks, I say. They'd enjoy to see it, too. He says nothing, watching the door. Then he looks down at the fish laying in the dust. He turns it over with his foot and prods at the eye bump with his toe, gouging at it. Anse is looking out over the land. Vardaman looks at Anse's face, then at the door. He turns, going toward the corner of the house, when Anse called him without looking around. You clean that fish, Anse says. Vardaman stops. Why can't you Adele clean it, he says. You clean that fish, Anse says. Oh, Paul, Vardaman says. You clean it, Anse says. He don't look around. Vardaman comes back and picks up the fish. It slides out of his hand, smearing wet dirt onto him, and flops down, dirtying itself again, gap-mouthed, goggle-eyed, hiding into the dust like it was ashamed of being dead, like it was in a hurry to get back hid again. Vardaman cusses it. He cusses it like a grown man standing astraddle of it. Anse don't look around. Vardaman picks it up again. He goes on around the house, toting it in both arms like an armful of wood, it overlapping him at both ends, head and tail, done nigh big as he is. Anse's wrists dangle out of his sleeves. I never seen him with a shirt on that looked like it was his in all my life. They all look like Jewel might have give him his old ones. Not Jewel, though. He's long-armed, even if he is spending. Except for the lack of sweat. You could tell they ain't been nobody else's but Anse that way without no mistake. His eyes look like pieces of burnt-out cinder fixed in his face, looking out over the land. When the shadow touches the steps, he says, it's 5 o'clock. Just as I get up, Cora comes to the door and says it's time to go on. Anse reaches for his shoes. Now, Mr. Bundren, Cora says, don't you get up now. He puts his shoes on, stomping into them, like he does everything, like he is hoping all the time he really can't do it and can quit trying to. When we go up the hall, we can hear them clumping on the floor like they was iron shoes. He comes toward the door where she is, blinking his eyes, kind of looking ahead of himself before he sees, like he is hoping to find her setting up in a chair maybe, or maybe sweeping, and looks into the door in that surprised way like he looks in and finds her still in bed every time, and Adele still a-fanning her with the fan. He stands there like he don't aim to move again nor nothing else. Well, I reckon we better get on, Cora says. I got to feed the chickens. It's fixing to rain, too. Clouds don't lie. The cotton making every day and the Lord sends. That'll be something else for him. Cash is still trimming at the boards. If there's a thing we can do, Cora says. Anse will let us know, I say. Anse don't look at us. He looks around, blinking in that surprised way, like he had wore himself down, being surprised, and was even surprised at that. If Cash just works that careful on my barn. I told Anse it likely won't be no need, I say. I so hope it. Her mind is set on it, he says. I reckon she's bound to go. Comes to all of us, Cora says. Let the Lord comfort you. About that corn, I say. I tell him again I will help him if he gets into a tight, with her sick and all. Like most folks around here, I done hope him so much already I can't quit now. I aim to get to it today, he says. Seems like I can't get my mind on nothing. Maybe she'll hold out till you're laid by, I say. If God wills it, he says, let him comfort you, Cora says. If Cash just works that careful on my barn, he looks up as we pass. Don't reckon I'll get to you this week, he says. Tain't no rush, I say, whenever you get around to it. We get into the wagon. Cora sets the cake box on her lap. It's fixing to rain show. I don't know what he'll do, Cora says. I just don't know. Poor Anse, I say. She kept him at work for 30-odd years. I reckon she is tired. And I reckon she'll be behind him for 30 years more, Kate says. Or if it ain't her, he'll get another one before cotton picking. I reckon Cash and Doll can get married now, Eula says. That poor boy, Cora says, that poor little tyke. What about Jewel, Kate says. He can too, Eula says. Huh, Kate says. I reckon he will. I reckon so. I reckon there's more gals than one around here that don't want to see Jewel tied down. Well, they don't need to worry. Why, Kate, Cora says. The wagon begins to rattle. The poor little tyke, Cora says. It's fixing to rain this night. Yes, sir. A rattling wagon is mighty dry weather for a bird cell, but that'll be cured. It will for a fact. She ought to take them cakes after she said she would, Kate says. Paul stands beside the bed. From behind his leg, Vardaman peers, with his round head and his eyes round, and his mouth beginning to open. She looks at Paul. All her failing life appears to drain into her eyes, urgent, irremediable. It's Jewel she wants, Duadel says. Why, Addie, Paul says, him and Doll went to make one more load. They thought there was time, that you would wait for them, and that $3 and all. He stoops, laying his hand on hers. For a while yet she looks at him without reproach, without anything at all, as if her eyes alone to listen to the irrevocable cessation of his voice. Then she raises herself, who has not moved in 10 days. Duadel leans down, trying to press her back. Ma, she says, Ma. She is looking out the window, at Cash stooping steadily at the board in the fading light, laboring on toward darkness and into it, as though the stroking of the saw illumined its own motion, board and saw engendered. You, Cash, she shouts, her voice harsh, strong, and unimpaired. You, Cash. He looks up at the gaunt face framed by the window in the twilight. It is a composite picture of all time since he was a child. He drops the saw and lifts the board for her to see, watching the window in which her face has not moved. He drags a second plank into position and slants the two of them into their final juxtaposition, gesturing toward the one jet on the ground, shaping with his empty hand in pantomime the finished box. For a while she still looks down at him from the composite picture, neither with censure nor approbation. Then the face disappears. She lies back and turns her head without so much as glancing at Paul. She looks at Vardaman, her eyes, the life in them rushing suddenly upon them. The two flames glare up for a steady instant. Then they go out as though someone had lain down and blown upon them. Ma, Duadel says, Ma, leaning above the bed, her hands lifted a little, the fan still moving like it was for 10 days, she begins to keen. Her voice is strong, young, tremulous and clear, wrapped with its own timbre and volume, the fan still moving steadily up and down, whispering the useless air. Then she flings herself across Addie Bundren's knees, clutching her, shaking her with the furious strength of the young, before sprawling suddenly across the handful of rotten bones that Addie Bundren left, jarring the whole bed into a chattering sibilant of mattress shucks. Her arms outflung and the fan in one hand still, beating with expiring breath into the quilt. From behind Paul's leg, Vardaman peers, his mouth full open and all color draining from his face into his mouth, as though he has by some means fleshed his own teeth in himself, sucking. He begins to move slowly backward from the bed, his eyes round, his pale face fading into the dust like a piece of paper pasted on a failing wall, and so out the door. Paul leans above the bed in the twilight, his humped silhouette partaking of that owl-like quality of a wry-feathered, disgruntled outrage, within which lurks a wisdom too profound or too inert for even thought. Darn them boys, he says. Jewel, I say, overhead the day drives level and gray, hiding the sun by a flight of gray spears. In the rain the mules smoke a little, splash yellow with mud, the off one clinging in sliding lunges to the side of the road above the ditch. The tilted lumber gleams dull yellow, water-soaked and heavy as lead, tilted at a steep angle into the ditch above the broken wheel. Above the shattered spokes and above Jewel's ankle, the runnel of yellow water, neither earth nor water swerves, curving with the yellow road, neither of earth nor water, down the hill, dissolving into a streaming mass of dark green, neither of earth nor sky. Jewel, I say. Cash comes to the door, carrying the saw. Paul stands beside the bed, humped, his arms dangling. He turns his head, his shabby profile, his chin collapsing slowly as he works the snuff against his gums. She's gone, Cash says. She's taken and left us, Paul says. Cash does not look at him. How nigh are you done, Paul says. Cash does not answer. He enters carrying the saw. I reckon you better get at it, Paul says. You'll have to do the best you can with them boys gone off that away. Cash looks down at her face. He is not listening to Paul at all. He does not approach the bed. He stops in the middle of the floor, the saw against his leg, his sweating arms powdered lightly with sawdust, his face composed. If you get in a tight, maybe some of them will get here tomorrow and help you, Paul says. Vernon could. Cash is not listening. He is looking down at her peaceful, rigid face fading into the dusk as though darkness were a precursor of the ultimate earth, until at last the face seems to float detached upon it, lightly as the reflection of a dead leaf. There's Christians enough to help you, Paul says. Cash is not listening. After a while he turns without looking at Paul and leaves the room. Then the saw begins to snore again. They will help us in our sorrow, Paul says. The sound of the saw is steady, competent, unhurried, stirring the dying light so that each stroke her face seems to wake a little into an expression of listening and of waiting, as though she were counting the strokes. Paul looks down at the face, at the black sprawl of Duadel's hair, the outflung arms, the clutched fan now motionless on the fading quilt. I reckon you better get supper on, he says. Duadel doesn't move. Get up now and put supper on, Paul says. We got to keep our strength up. I reckon Dr. Peabody's right hungry coming all this way, and Cash will need to eat quick and get back to work so he can finish it in time. Duadel rises, heaving to her feet. She looks down at the face. It is like a casting of fading bronze upon the pillar. The hands alone still within a semblance of life, a curl, gnawed inertness, a spent yet alert quality from which weariness, exhaustion, travail has not yet departed. As though they doubted even yet the actuality of rest, guarding with haunted and penurious alertness the cessation which they know cannot last. Duadel stoops and slides the quilt from beneath them and draws it up over them to the chin, smoothing it down, drawing it smooth. Then, without looking at Paul, she goes around the bed and leaves the room. She will go out where Peabody is, where she can stand in the twilight and look at his back with such an expression that, feeling her eyes and turning, he will say, I would not let it grieve me now. She was old and sick too, suffering more than we knew. She couldn't have got well. Vardaman's getting big now, and with you to take good care of them all, I would try not to let it grieve me. I expect you'd better go and get some supper ready. It don't have to be much, but they'll need to eat. And she looking at him saying, you could do so much for me if you just would, if you just knew. I am I, and you're you, and I know it, and you don't know it. And you could do so much for me if you just would. And if you just would, then I could tell you, and then nobody would have to know it except you and me and Doll. Paul stands over the bed, dangle-armed, humped, motionless. He raises his hand to his head, scouring his hair, listening to the soul. He comes nearer and rubs his hand, palm and back on his thigh, and lays it on her face, and then on the hump of quilt where her hands are. He touches the quilt as he saw Duadel do, trying to smooth it up to the chin, but disarranging it instead. He tries to smooth it again clumsily, his hand awkward as a claw, smoothing at the wrinkles which he made and which continued to emerge beneath his hand with perverse ubiquity, so that at last he desists, his hand falling to his side, and stroking itself again, palm and back on his thigh. The sound of the soft snore steadily into the room. Paul breathed with a quiet rasping sound, mouthing the snuff against his gums. God's will be done, he says. Now I can get them teeth. Jewel's hat droops limp over his neck, channeling water onto the soaked toe sack tied about his shoulders. As ankle deep in the running ditch, he pries with a slipping 2x4 with a piece of rotting log for fulcrum at the axle. Jewel, I say she is dead. Jewel, Addie Bundren is dead. Then I begin to run. I run toward the back and come to the edge of the porch and stop. Then I begin to cry. I can feel where the fish was in the dust. It is cut up into pieces of not fish now, not blood on my hands and overhauls. Then it wasn't so. It hadn't happened then. And now she is getting so far ahead I cannot catch her. The trees look like chickens when they ruffle out into the cool dust on the hot days. If I jump off the porch, I can be where the fish was, and it all cut up into not fish now. I can hear the bed and her face in them, and I can feel the floor shake when he walks on it. That came and did it. That came and did it when she was all right, but he come and did it. That fat son of a bitch. I jump from the porch running. The top of the barn comes swooping up out of the twilight. If I jump, I can go through it like the pink lady in the circus, into the warm smelling, without having to wait. My hands grab at the bushes. Beneath my feet, the rocks and dirt go rubbling down. Then I can breathe again in the warm smelling. I enter the stall, trying to touch him, and then I can cry. Then I can vomit, the crying. As soon as he gets through kicking, I can, and then I can cry, the crying can. He killed her. He killed her. The life in him runs under the skin, under my hand, running through the splotches, smelling up into my nose where the sickness is beginning to cry, vomiting the crying, and then I can breathe, vomiting it. It makes a lot of noise. I can smell the life running up from under my hands, up my arms, and then I can leave the stall. I cannot find it. In the dark, along the dust, the walls, I cannot find it. The crying makes a lot of noise. I wish it wouldn't make so much noise. Then I find it in the wagon shed, in the dust, and I run across the lot and into the road, the stick jouncing on my shoulder. They watch me as I run, beginning to jerk back, their eyes rolling, snorting, jerking back on the hitch rein. I strike. I can hear the stick strike, and I can see it hitting their heads, the breast yoke missing altogether sometimes as they rear and plunge, but I am glad. You killed my ball. The stick breaks. They're raring and snorting, their feet popping loud on the ground. Loud because it is going to rain, and the air is empty for the rain, but it is still long enough. I run this way and that as they rear and jack at the hitch rein, striking. You killed her. I strike at them, striking. They wheeling in long lunges, the buggy wheeling on two wheels, and motionless like it is nailed to the ground, and the horses motionless like they are nailed by the hind feet to the center of a whirling plate. I run in the dust. I cannot see, running in the sucking dust where the buggy vanishes on tilted wheels. I strike, the stick hitting into the ground, bouncing, striking into the dust, and then into the air again, and the dust sucking on down the road faster than if a car was in it. And then I can cry, looking at the stick. It is broken down to my hand, not longer than stove wood that was a long stick. I throw it away and I can cry. It does not make so much noise now. The cow is standing in the barn door chewing. When she sees me, she comes into the lot. She lolls, her mouth full of flopping green, her tongue flopping. I ain't a-going to milk you. I ain't a-going to do nothing for them. I turn to her when I pass. When I turn, she is just behind me with her sweet, hot, hard breath. Didn't I tell you I wouldn't? She nudges me, snuffling. She moans deep inside, her mouth closed. I jerk my hand, cursing her like Jewel does. Get now. I stoop my hand to the ground and run at her. She jumps back and whirls away and stops watching me. She moans. She goes on to the path and stands there looking up the path. It is dark in the barn, warm, smelling, silent. I can cry quietly, watching the top of the hill. Cash comes to the hill, limping where he fell off the church. He looks down at the spring, then up the road and back toward the barn. He comes down the path stiffly and looks at the broken hitch rein and at the dust in the road, and then up the road where the dust is gone. I hope they've got clean past tolls by now. I so hope it. Cash turns and limps up the path. Done him? I showed him. Done him? I am not crying now. I am not anything. Dewdell comes to the hill and calls me. Vardaman? I am not anything. I am quiet. You, Vardaman? I can cry quiet now, feeling and hearing my tears. Then it won't. It hadn't happened then. It was a-laying right there on the ground, and now she's getting ready to cook it. It is dark. I can hear woods, silence. I know them, but not living sound, not even him. It is as though the dark were resolving him out of his integrity into an unrelated scattering of components, snuffing and stamping, smelling of cool flesh and ammoniac hair, of illusion of a coordinated whole of spotched hide and strong bones within which, detached and secret and familiar, and ears, different from my ears, I see him dissolve, legs, a rolling eye, gauded spotching like cold flames, and float upon the dark in fading solution, all one yet neither, all either yet none. I can see hearing call toward him, caressing, shaping his hard shape, fetlock, hips, shoulder, and head, smell and sound. I am not afraid. Cooked and ate, cooked and ate. When they get it finished, they are going to put her in it. And then for a long time I couldn't say it. I saw the dog stand up and go whirling away, and I said, "Are you going to nail her up in it, Cash? Cash? Cash?" I got shut up in the crib. The new door was too heavy for me. It went shut. I couldn't breathe because the rat was breathing up all the air. I said, "Are you going to nail her up in it, Cash? Nail it? Nail it?" Pa walks around. His shadow walks around, over Cash going up and down above the saw at the bleeding plank. Dewdell said we will get some bananas. The train is behind the glass, red on the track. When it runs, the track shines on and off. Pa said flour and sugar and coffee cost so much. Because I am a country boy, because boys in town, bicycles. Why do flour and sugar and coffee cost so much when he is a country boy? Wouldn't you rather have some bananas instead? Bananas are gone, eaten, gone. When it runs on the track, shines again. Why ain't I a town boy, Pa? I said. God made me. I did not said to God to make me in the country. If he can make the train, why can't he make them all in town? Because flour and sugar and coffee. Wouldn't you rather have bananas? He walks around. His shadow walks around. It was not her. I was there looking. I saw. I thought it was her, but it was not. It was not my mother. She went away when the other one laid down in her bed and drew the quilt up. She went away. Did she go as far as town? She went further than town. Did all those rabbits and possums go further than town? God made the rabbits and possums. He made the train. Why must he make a different place for them to go if she is just like the rabbit? Pa walks around. His shadow does. The saw sounds like it is asleep. And so if Cash nails the box up, she is not a rabbit. And so if she is not a rabbit, I couldn't breathe in the crib, and Cash is going to nail it up. And so if she lets him, it is not her. I know, I was there. I saw when it did not be her. I saw. They think it is, and Cash is going to nail it up. It was not her because it was laying right yonder in the dirt, and now it's all chopped up. I chopped it up. It's laying in the kitchen in the bleeding pan, waiting to be cooked and ate. Then it wasn't, and she was, and now it is, and she wasn't. And tomorrow it will be cooked and ate, and she will be him and Paul and Cash and Dell, and there won't be anything in the box, and so she can breathe. It was laying right yonder on the ground. I can get Vernon. He was there, and he's seen it. With both of us it will be, and then it will not be. Don't be afraid, the corporal said. There's nothing to be afraid of, nothing worth it. For a moment the old general didn't seem to have heard the corporal at all, standing a head below the other's high mountain one, beneath the seemingly insuperable weight of the blue and scarlet hat cross-barred and dappled with gold braids and heavy golden leaves. Then he said, afraid? No, no, it's not I, but you who are afraid of man. Not I, but you who believe that nothing but a death can save him. I know better. I know that he has that in him which will enable him to outlast even his wars, that in him more durable than all his vices, even that last and most fearsome one, to outlast even his next avatar of his servitude which he now faces, his enslavement to the demonic progeny of his own mechanical curiosity, from which he will emancipate himself by that one ancient tried and true method by which slaves have always freed themselves, by inculcating their masters with the slave's own vices, in this case the vice of war, and that other one which is no vice at all, but instead is the quality mark and the warrant of man's immortality, his deathless folly. He has already begun to put wheels under his patio, his terrace, and his front veranda. Even at my age, I may see the day when what was once his house has become a storage place for his bed and stove and razor and spare clothing. You with your youth could, remember that bird, see the day when he will have invented his own private climate and moved its stove, bathroom, bed, clothing, kitchen, and all into his automobile, and what he once called home will have vanished from human lexicon, so that he won't dismount from his automobile at all because he won't need to. The entire earth, one unbroken machine, demountain, disrivered expanse of concrete paving, protuberanceless by a tree or bush or house or anything which might constitute a corner or threaten his visibility. And man in his terrapin myriads and clothed, clothless from birth, in his individual wheeled and glove-like envelope, with pipes and hoses leading upward from underground reservoirs to charge him with one composite squirt, which at one mutual instant will fuel his mobility, pamper his lust, sate his appetites, and fire his dreams. Peripatetic, unceasing, and long since no longer countable, to die at last at the click of an automatic circuit break on a speedometer dial, and long since freed of bone and organ and gut, leaving nothing for communal scavenging but a rusting and odorless shell, the shell which he does not get out of because he does not need to, but which presently for a time he will not emerge from because he does not dare, because the shell will be his only protection from the hail-like iron refuse from his wars, because by that time his wars will have dispossessed him by simple outdistance. His simple, frail physique will no longer be able to keep up, bear them, attend them, be present. He will try, of course, and for a little while he will even hold his own. He will build tanks bigger and faster and more impervious, with more firepower than any before. He will build aircraft bigger and faster and capable of more load and more destruction than any yet. For a little while he will accompany, direct, as he thinks control them, even after he has finally realized that it is not another frail and mortal dissident to his politics or his notions of national boundaries that he is contending with, but the very monster itself which he inhabits. It will not be someone firing bullets at him who for the moment doesn't like him. It will be his own Frankenstein, which roasts him alive with heat, asphyxiates him with speed, wrenches loose his still living entrails in the ferocity of his prey-seeking stoop. So he will not be able to go along with it at all, though for a little while longer it will permit him the harmless delusion that he controls it from the ground with buttons. Then that too will be gone. Years, decades, then centuries will have elapsed since it last answered his voice. He will have even forgotten the very location of its breeding grounds, and his last contact with it will be a day when he will crawl shivering out of his cooling burrow to crouch among the delicate stalks of his dead antennae like a thyrogeometry beneath a clangorous rain of dials and meters and switches and bloodless fragments of metal epidermis, to watch the final two of them engaged in the last gigantic wrestling amidst the final and dying sky, robbed even of darkness, and filled with the inflectionless uproar of the two mechanical voices bellowing at each other polysyllabic and verbalist patriotic nonsense. Oh yes, he will survive it because he has that in him which will endure even beyond the ultimate worthless, tideless rock, freezing slowly in the last red and heatless sunset. Because already the next star in the blue immensity of space will be already clamorous with the uproar of his debarkation, his puny and inexhaustible voice still talking, still planning, and there, too, after the last ding-dong of doom has rung and died, there will still be one more sound, his voice, planning still, to build something higher and faster and louder, more efficient and louder and faster than ever before. Yet it, too, inherent with the same old primordial force, since it, too, in the end will fail to eradicate him from the earth. I don't fear man. I do better. I respect and admire him, and pride. I am 10 times prouder of that immortality which he does possess, than ever he of that heavenly one of his delusion, because man and his folly will endure, the corporal said. They will do more, the old general said proudly. They will prevail. Even when he tried to tell it, even after the 7 weeks, and he safe, secure, riveted, warranted, and doubly guaranteed by the 10 years they had added to his sentence for attempted escape, something of the old hysteric, incredulous outrage came back into his face, his voice, his speech. He never did even get on the other boat. He told how he clung to a strake. It was a dirty, unpainted shanty boat with a drunken rake of 10 stovepipes. It had been moving when he struck it, and apparently it had not even changed course, even though the 3 people on it must have been watching him all the while. A second man, barefoot and with matted hair and beard, also at the steering sweep, and then, he did not know how long, a woman leaning in the door in a filthy assortment of men's garments, watching him too with the same cold speculation, being dragged violently along, trying to state and explain his simple, and to him at least, reasonable desire and need. Telling it, trying to tell it. He could feel again the old unforgettable affronting, like an egg fit, as he watched the abortive tobacco rain steadily and faintly from between his shaking hands, and then the paper itself part with a thin, dry, snapping report. "Burn my clothes," the convict cried. "Burn them? How in hell do you expect to escape in them billboards?" the man with the shotgun said. He, the convict, tried to tell it, tried to explain as he had tried to explain not to the 3 people on the boat alone, but to the entire circumambulance, desolate water and forlorn trees and sky, not for justification, because he needed none. And he knew that his hearers, the other convicts, required none of him, but rather as, on the point of exhaustion, he might have picked dreamily and incredulously at a suffocation. He told the man with the gun how he and his partner had been given the boat and told to pick up a man and a woman, how he had lost his partner and failed to find the man. And now all in the world he wanted was something flat to leave the woman on until he could find an officer, a sheriff. He thought of home, the place where he had lived almost since childhood, his friends of years whose ways he knew and who knew his ways, the familiar fields where he did work he had learned to do well and to like, the mules with characters he knew and respected, as he knew and respected the characters of certain men. He thought of the barracks at night, the screens against the bugs in summer and good stoves in winter, and someone to supply the fuel and the food too, the Sunday ball games and the picture shows, things which, with the exception of the ball games, he had never known before. But most of all, his own character. 2 years ago they had offered to make a trustee of him. He would not longer need to plow nor feed stock. He would only follow those who did with a loaded gun, but he declined. "I reckon I'll stick to plowing," he said, absolutely without humor. "I done already tried to use a gun one time too many." His good name, his responsibility not only toward those who were responsible toward him, but to himself, his own honor in doing of what was asked of him, his pride in being able to do it, no matter what it was. He thought of this and listened to the man with the gun talking about escape, and it seemed to him that hanging there, being dragged violently along, it was here, he said, that he first noticed the goat's beard, the moss, and the trees. Though it could have been there for several days, so far as he knew. It just happened that he first noticed it here. that he would simply burst. "Can't you get it into your head that the last thing I want to do is to run away?" he cried. "You can sit there with that gun and watch me. I give you fair leave. All I want is to put this woman, and I told you she could come aboard," the man with the gun said in his level voice. "But there ain't no room on no boat of mine for nobody hunting a sheriff in no kind of clothes, let alone a penitentiary suit." "When he steps aboard, knock him in the head with the gun barrel," the man at the sweep said. "He's drunk." "He ain't coming aboard," the man with the gun said. "He's crazy." Then the woman spoke. She didn't move, leaning in the door in a pair of faded and patched and filthy overalls like the two men. "Give them some grub and tell them to get out of here." She moved. She crossed the deck and looked down at the convict's companion with her cold, sullen face. "How much more time have you got?" "It wasn't you till next month," the woman in the boat said, "but I—" The woman in overalls turned to the man with the gun. "Give them some grub," she said. But the man with the gun was still looking down at the woman in the boat. "Come on," he said to the convict. "Put her aboard and beat it." "And what'll happen to you," the woman in overalls said, "when you try to turn her over to an officer, when you lay alongside a sheriff and the sheriff asks you who you are?" Still the man with the gun didn't even look at her. He hardly even shifted the gun across his arm as he struck the woman across the face with the back of his other hand, hard. "You son of a bitch," he said. Still the man with the gun did not even look at her. "Well," he said to the convict. "Don't you see I can't?" the convict cried. "Can't you see that?" Now, he said, he gave up. He was doomed. That is, he knew now that he had been doomed from the very start, never to get rid of her. Just as the ones who sent him out with the skiff knew that he never would actually give up. When he recognized one of the objects which the woman in overalls was hurling into the skiff to be a can of condensed milk, he believed it to be a presage, gratuitous and irrevocable as a death notice over the telegraph, that he was not even to find a flat stationary surface in time for the child to be born on. So he told how he held the skiff alongside the shanty boat while the first tentative toying of the second wave made up beneath him, while the woman in overalls passed back and forth between the house and the rail, flinging the food, the hunk of salt meat, the ragged and filthy quilt, the scorched lumps of cold bread which she poured into the skiff from a heaped dishpan like so much garbage, while he clung to the strake against the mounting pull of the current, the new wave which for the moment he had forgotten because he was still trying to state the incredible simplicity of his desire and need, until the man with the gun, the only one of the three who wore shoes, began to stamp at his hands, he snatching his hands away one at a time to avoid the heavy shoes, then grasping the rail again until the man with the gun kicked at his face. He flinging himself sideways to avoid the shoe and so breaking his hold on the rail, his weight canting the skiff off at a tangent on the increasing current, so that it began to leave the shanty boat behind, and he paddling again now violently, as a man hurries toward the precipice for which he knows at last he is doomed, looking back at the other boat, the three faces sullen and derisive, and grim and rapidly diminishing across the widening water, and at last apologetic, suffocating with the intolerable fact, not that he had been refused, but that he had been refused so little, had wanted so little, asked for so little, yet there had been demanded of him in return the one price out of all breath, which they must have known, if he could have paid it, he would not have been where he was, asking what he asked, raising the paddle and shaking it and screaming curses back at them, even after the shotgun flashed and the charge went scuttering past along the water to one side. So he hung there, he said, shaking the paddle and howling, when suddenly he remembered that other wave, the second wall of water full of houses and dead mules building up behind him back in the swamp. So he quit yelling then and went back to paddling. He was not trying to outrun it. He just knew from experience that when it overtook him, he would have to travel in the same direction it was moving in anyway, whether he wanted to or not. And when it did overtake him, he would begin to move too fast to stop, no matter what places he might come to where he could leave the woman, land her in time. Time, that was his itch now, so his only chance was to stay ahead of it as long as he could and hope to reach something before it struck. So he went on driving the skiff with muscles which had been too tired too long. They had quit feeling it, as when a man has had bad luck for so long that he ceases to believe it is even bad, let alone luck. Even when he ate, the scorched lumps the size of baseballs and the weight and durability of cannel coal, even after having lain in the skiff's bilge where the shantyboat woman had thrown them, the iron-like, lead-heavy objects which no man would have called bread outside of the crusted and scorched pan in which they had cooked. It was with one hand, begrudging even that from the paddle. He tried to tell that too, the day while the skiff fled on among the bearded trees, while every now and then small, quiet, tentative exploratory feelers came up from the wave behind and toy for a moment at the skiff, light and curious, then go on with a faint hissing sighing, almost a chuckling sound. The skiff going on, driving on with nothing else but trees and water and solitude, until after a while it no longer seemed to him that he was trying to put space and distance behind him or shorten space and distance ahead, but that both he and the wave were now hanging suspended, simultaneous and unprogressing in pure time, upon a dreamy desolation in which he paddled on, not from any hope even to reach anything at all, but merely to keep intact what little of distance the length of the skiff provided between himself and the inert and inescapable mass of female meat before him. Then night, and the skiff rushing on, fast, since any speed over anything unknown and invisible is too fast, with nothing before him and behind him, the outrageous ideal volume of moving water toppling forward, its crest frothed and shredded like fangs, and then dawn again, another of those dreamlike alternations, day to dark, then back to day again, with that quality truncated, anachronic, and unreal, as the waxing and waning of lights in a theater scene. The skiff emerging now with the woman no longer supine beneath the shrunken soaked private's coat, but sitting bolt upright, gripping the gunwale with both hands, her eyes closed and her lower lip caught between her teeth, and he driving the splintered board furiously now, glaring at her out of his wild, swollen, sleepless face, and crying, croaking, "Hold on, for God's sake, hold on." "I'm trying to," she said, "but hurry, hurry." He told it, the unbelievable, hurry, hasten, the man falling from a cliff being told to catch on to something and save himself. The very telling of it emerging shadowy and burlesque, ludicrous, comic and mad, from the ague of unbearable forgetting, with a quality more dreamily furious than any fable behind proscenium lights. He was in a basin now. "A basin," the plump convict said. "That's what you wash in." "All right," the tall one said harshly above his hands. "I did." With a supreme effort he stilled them long enough to release the 2 bits of cigarette paper and watch them waft in light fluttering indecision to the floor between his feet, holding his hands motionless even for a moment longer. A basin, a broad, peaceful yellow sea which had abruptly and curiously ordered air, giving him, even at that moment, the impression that it was accustomed to water, even if not total submersion. He even remembered the name of it, told to him 2 or 3 weeks later by someone, a Chafalao. "Louisiana," the plump convict said. "You mean you were clean out of Mississippi?" "Hellfire." He stared at the tall one. "Shucks," he said. "That ain't but just across from Vicksburg." "They never named any Vicksburg across from where I was," the tall one said. "It was Baton Rouge they named it." And now he began to talk about a town, a little neat white portrait town nesting among enormous, very green trees, appearing suddenly in the telling as it probably appeared in actuality, abrupt and airy and mirage-like, and incredibly serene before him behind a scattering of boats moored to a line of freight cars, standing flush to the doors in water. And now he tried to tell that too, how he stood waist deep in water for a moment, looking back and down at the skiff in which the woman half lay, her eyes still closed, her knuckles white on the gunwales, and a tiny thread of blood creeping down her chin from her chewed lip, and he looking down at her in a kind of furious desperation. "How far will I have to walk?" she said. "I don't know, I tell you," he cried, "but it's land somewhere yonder. It's land, houses. If I try to move, it won't even be borne inside a boat," she said. "You'll have to get closer." "Yes," he cried, wild, desperate, incredulous. "Wait, I'll go and surrender, and then they will have—" He didn't finish. Wait to finish. He told that too. Himself splashing, stumbling, trying to run, sobbing and grasping. Now he saw it, another loading platform, and standing above the yellow flood, the khaki figures on it before, identical, the same. He said how the intervening days since that first innocent morning telescope vanished, as if they had never been, the 2 contiguous succeeding instants, succeeding simultaneous. Had he transported across no intervening space, but merely turned in his own footsteps, plunging, splashing, his arms raised, croaking harshly, he heard the startled shout. "There's one of them," the command, the clash of equipment, the alarm cry. "There he goes, there he goes." "Yes," he cried, running, plunging. "Here I am, here, here," running on into the first scattered volley, stopping among the bullets, waving his arms, shrieking, "I want to surrender, I want to surrender." Watching not in terror but in amazement, an absolutely unbearable outrage, as a squatting clump of the khaki figures parted, and he saw the machine gun, the blunt, thick muzzle slant and drop and probe toward him, and he's still screaming in his hoarse crow's voice, "I want to surrender. Can't you hear me?" continuing to scream even as he whirled and plunged, splashing, ducking, went completely under, and heard the bullets going thunk, 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 thunk on the water above him. And he scrabbling still on the bottom, still trying to scream even before he regained his feet, and still all submerged save his plunging, unmistakable buttock, the outraged screaming bubbling from his mouth and about his face, since he merely wanted to surrender. Then he was comparatively screened, out of range, though not for long. That is, he didn't tell how far nor where. There was a moment in which he paused, breathed for a second, before running again. The course back to the skiff opened for the time being, though he could still hear the shouts behind him, and now and then a shot. And he, panting, sobbing, a long, savage tear in the flesh of one hand, got when and how he did not know. And he wasting precious breath, speaking to no one now any more than the scream of the dying rabbit is addressed to an immortal ear, but rather an indictment of all breath and its folly and suffering, its infinite capacity for folly and pain, which seems to be its only immortality. All in the world I want is just to surrender. He returned to the skiff and got in and took up his splintered plank. And now when he told this, despite the fury of the element which climaxed it, the telling became quite simple. He now even creased another cigarette paper between his fingers, which did not tremble at all, and filled the paper from the tobacco sack without spilling a flake, as though he had passed from the machine gun's barrage into a bourne beyond any more amazement, so that the subsequent part of his narrative seemed to reach his listeners as though from beyond a sheet of slightly milky, though still transparent glass, as something not heard but seen, a series of shadows, edgeless yet distinct, and smoothly flowing, logical and unfrantic, making no sound. They were in the skiff, in the center of the broad, placid trough which had no boundaries, and down which the tiny forlorn skiff flew to the irresistible coercion of a current going once more he knew not where. The neat, small, live oak-bowered towns, unattainable and mirage-like, and apparently attached to nothing upon the airy and unchanging horizon. He did not believe them. They did not matter. He was doomed. They were less than figments of smoke or of delirium, and he was driving his unceasing paddle without destination or even hope now, looking now and then at the woman sitting with her knees drawn up and locked, and her entire body one terrific clench, while the threads of bloody saliva crept from her teeth-clenched lower lip. He was going nowhere and fleeing from nothing. He merely continued to paddle because he had paddled so long now that he believed if he stopped his muscle would scream in agony. So when it happened, he was not surprised. He heard the sound which he knew well. He had heard it but once before, true enough, but no man need hear it but once. And he had been expecting it. He looked back, still driving the paddle, and saw it curl, crested with its straw-like flotsam of trees and debris and dead beasts. And he glared over his shoulder as for a full minute out of that attenuation far beyond the point of outragement, where even suffering, the capability of being further affronted, had ceased, from which he now contemplated with savage and invulnerable curiosity the further extent to which his now anesthetized nerves could bear, what next could be invented for them to bear, until the wave actually began to rear over his head in its thundering climax. Then only did he turn his head. His stroke did not falter, it neither slowed nor increased. Still paddling with a spent hypnotic steadiness, he saw the swimming deer. He did not know what it was, nor that he had altered the skiff's course to follow it. He just watched the swimming head before him as the wave boiled down and the skiff rose bodily in the old familiar fashion on a wealth of tossing trees and houses and bridges and fences. He still paddling even while the paddle found no purchase save air, and still paddle even as he and the deer shot forward side by side at arm's length. He watching the deer now, watching the deer begin to rise out of the water bodily until it was actually running along the surface, still rising, soaring clear of the water altogether, vanishing upward in a dying crescendo of splashings and snapping branches, its damp scud flashing upward, the entire animal vanishing upward as smoke vanishes. And now the skiff struck and canted, and he was out of it too, standing knee-deep, springing out and falling to his knees, scrabbling up, glaring after the vanished deer. "Land," he croaked, "land, hold on, just hold on." He caught the woman beneath the arms, dragging her out of the boat, plunging and panting after the vanished deer. Now earth actually appeared, an acclivity smooth and swift and steep, bizarre, solid and unbelievable, an Indian mound. And he plunging at the muddy slope, slipping back, the woman struggling in his muddy hand. "Let me down," she cried, "let me down." But he held her, panting, sobbing, and rushed again at the muddy slope. He had almost reached the flat crest with his now violently unmanageable burden when a stick under his foot gathered itself with a thick convulsive speed. It was a snake, he thought, as his feet fled beneath him, and with the indubitable last of his strength, he half pushed and half flung the woman up the bank as he shot feet first and face down back into that medium upon which he had lived for more days and nights than he could remember, and from which he himself had never completely emerged, as if his own failed and spent flesh were attempting to carry out his furious, unflagging will for severance at any price, even that of drowning, from the burden with which, unwitting and without choice, he had been doomed. Later it seemed to him that he had carried back beneath the surface with him the sound of the infant's first mewling cry.